Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about the Orks, the Green Tide, the unstoppable, roaring, fight-loving force of nature that sweeps across the galaxy like a plague with guns. To most people in the Warhammer 40k universe, they're little more than a blunt instrument, a wall of muscle, crude machinery, and louder-than-life personalities that crash into anything in their way. They're not subtle, they're not graceful, and they certainly aren't the kind of faction you'd expect to have any connection to something as vast and monumental as the birth of the Imperium of Man. And yet, what if they did? What if, somewhere in the chaotic mess of Ork history, there's a thread that weaves directly into the foundation of humanity's greatest empire? Because here's the thing, the Orks have been around for a long time, longer than humanity, longer than most of the galaxy's current powers. They're not just some random accident of evolution. They were built to survive, to fight, and to keep fighting no matter what. That kind of design isn't just lucky, it's intentional. And when you start digging into who built them and why, you stumble onto some wild possibilities. See, most fans like to think of the Imperium as this towering achievement of human grit and willpower, forged by the Emperor and his armies through sheer determination. But there's another angle, one that's far more uncomfortable, the idea that the Imperium's rise wasn't entirely a human story. That maybe, just maybe, it had some very strange and very green help along the way. Not because the Orks wanted it, of course, Emperor forbid they'd plan something so complicated, but because the galaxy doesn't work in straight lines. Sometimes chaos builds order without even meaning to. And that's where the rabbit hole begins. Orks weren't always the comic relief barbarians that some players imagine them to be. Beneath the crude jokes, the shouting, and the endless wach, there's a history so ancient and so alien that most Imperial historians wouldn't even know where to start looking. It's a history tied to wars that predate the Imperium by millions of years, to godlike entities whose hands shape the galaxy itself. And if you start connecting those dots, well, you might end up asking a question most people would laugh off. Did the Orks, in some strange and twisted way, help create the Imperium of Man? We're not talking about alliances or political deals here. Orks don't do treaties unless there's a fight in it. We're talking about something deeper, more indirect. A kind of brutal, unintentional mentorship, where the presence of Orks forced humanity to evolve, to innovate, and to become something it could never have been without such a relentless predator breathing down its neck. It's a theory that sits somewhere between wild speculation and a terrifying kind of logic. And over the course of this story, we're going to dig into it piece by piece, from the Orks' oldest origins, to the battles that may have shaped the Emperor's vision, to the role they still play in keeping the Imperium sharp, even if no one in the High Lord's Council would ever admit it. So buckle up, because the history of the Orks isn't just about greenskins smashing skulls. It's about the possibility that, without them, the Imperium might never have been born at all. And that's a truth the galaxy might not be ready to hear. The Orks are one of the few species in the galaxy whose origin story is less of a mystery and more of a warning about what happens when gods play with biology. They weren't born on some idyllic world, slowly evolving from primitive hunters into a galactic menace. They were made, deliberately, methodically, and with one single purpose: to fight wars on a scale that no mortal race could ever truly comprehend. Their creators, the ancient Old Ones, were not just advanced, they were on a level of mastery over genetics, psychic power, and planetary engineering that makes even the Adeptus Mechanicus look like cavemen banging rocks together. And when the galaxy was young, these Old Ones found themselves locked in the kind of conflict that would burn entire star systems to ash: the war in heaven. This war wasn't fought over territory or ideology. It was a war of survival, a war between the Old Ones and the Cetan-backed Necron that would decide the fate of the galaxy for millions of years to come. The Old Ones needed weapons, living, self-sustaining weapons, that could endure environments too hostile for delicate machinery, breed rapidly, and keep fighting no matter what was thrown at them. They needed soldiers who wouldn't lose morale, who wouldn't question orders, and who could adapt faster than any enemy could anticipate. That's where the Krork came in, the ancient, original form of what we now call Orks. The Krork weren't some ragtag bunch of green hooligans shouting and smashing things with whatever scrap metal they could find. They were enormous, far stronger and more durable than modern orcs, and highly intelligent by comparison. Imagine a creature with the sheer brute force of a squiggoth, the cunning of a seasoned warboss, and the tactical precision of a human general. These were beings built to hunt god machines and tear apart the armies of the Necron in close combat. And the Old Ones made sure their biology was perfect for the task. This is where the Orcs' unique nature starts to make sense. They aren't just flesh and bone, they're living machines in a way. Their bodies can survive wounds that would kill anything else, shrug off disease, and adapt to climates from ice worlds to volcanic hellscapes. Even more terrifying, they carry a form of racial memory in their genes. A newly grown orc doesn't have to learn how to fire a shooter or fix a truck. It just knows. That's a deliberate design choice, a built-in manual for war embedded in their DNA. The Old Ones didn't want an army that had to be trained. They wanted soldiers that could spring fully ready for battle from the moment they reached adulthood. And then there's their most infamous feature, the psychic field. Orcs, even without trying, generate a massive collective psychic presence that bends reality in small but terrifying ways. Their weapons work because they believe they work. Their vehicles keep running long past the point where human engineering would have given up. In the War in Heaven, this made them invaluable against the Necrons, whose soulless machines were vulnerable to the raw, chaotic force of the Orcs' psychic energy. Some fans even theorize that the Old Ones deliberately tied this power to Orc belief to ensure that their creations would never turn into cold, calculating rebels. They'd always stay bound to their love of fighting. The tragedy, or maybe the genius, of the Old Ones' plan is that the Krork were too perfect. They fought with such ferocity and resilience that they outlasted their creators. When the Old Ones fell, consumed by the combined forces of the Necrons and the Titan, the Krork didn't disappear. They kept going, breaking down over millions of years into the Orcs we know now. Smaller, less organized, more chaotic. But that spark of their original design never went away. It's in their bones, in their instincts, in the way they can rebuild from almost nothing and thrive in a galaxy that should have wiped them out 100 times over. And here's where the link to the Imperium starts to look less like fan fiction and more like an uncomfortable truth. The Orcs have been in the galaxy since before humanity's first ancestors even crawled onto land. They were already out there when humans were just stardust and microbes. They've shaped the ecosystem of war for millions of years, forcing every race they encounter to adapt or die. If the Old Ones hadn't created them, maybe the galaxy wouldn't have been such a crucible for survival. Maybe humanity's path to galactic dominance would have been slower, softer, and less prepared for the kind of eternal warfare the Imperium was born into. Some fans take it further, arguing that the Orcs are the last living legacy of the Old Ones' military genius, a green reminder that empires rise and fall, but war is forever. And if that's true, then the Imperium's very DNA, its obsession with war, its culture of eternal vigilance, might have been shaped in the shadow of those ancient, unstoppable warriors who fought for gods long dead. When you really look at how the Old Ones made the Orcs, you can see that every single feature of their biology was the result of deliberate design. They weren't just aiming to make a powerful soldier. They were building the ultimate self-sustaining war machine, a species that didn't just win battles, but could endure for millions of years without any need for supply chains, centralized command, or even a functioning civilization. This is what makes them so different from every other warrior race in the galaxy. The Krork and the Orcs they eventually became are not soldiers that fight for a cause. They are the cause. Their very existence ensures conflict will continue, because conflict is literally how they live. The Old Ones gave them an ecosystem in miniature. Orcs aren't a species in the conventional sense. They are a complete military ecosystem that travels with itself wherever it goes. Their spores ensure that every battlefield they touch becomes a seedbed for future Orcs, Gretchen, Squigs, and the various other creatures that make their societies function. You kill an Orc, and in a few months, the soil where it fell is teeming with life that grows into more Orcs, ready to fight again. There's no need for nurseries, no need for agriculture in the traditional sense. The old ones built them so they could drop onto a planet, fight, and within weeks have the numbers to overwhelm entire populations. But the real genius, or insanity, depending on your perspective, is in the combination of their physiology and psychology. Orcs were designed to enjoy war, to crave it. They aren't traumatized by battle, they don't burn out, and they don't require the elaborate discipline systems that human armies need to stop their soldiers from falling apart. In fact, an orc denied a fight for too long will start one just to feel alive. That means you can deploy them into the most hellish war zones imaginable and know that they'll thrive where other troops would break. The old ones ensured that the Krork never needed motivation beyond the joy of smashing an enemy's face in. And then there's the way orcs think. On the surface, it's easy to dismiss them as stupid, all shouting and crude plans. But their intelligence works differently. They are savants in anything related to fighting and building war gear. That genetic memory means they don't just know how to swing an axe. They know how to maintain a plasma cannon, pilot a fighter, or assemble a tank from the rusted skeleton of 3 other wrecks. The old ones clearly didn't want to waste time teaching their creations. They just encoded everything into their biology. That also explains why orc tech, while crude-looking, often works in ways the Adeptus Mechanicus still can't fully explain. It's not that orcs understand the science, it's that the science understands them. Fans often point out that this kind of design is almost too perfect to be just about winning the war in heaven. There's a theory that the old ones weren't only making weapons for that one conflict, but were trying to create a permanent balancing force for the galaxy. Something that could prevent any one race from ever gaining total control again. If that's true, then humanity's rise to galactic prominence was never going to be a smooth, peaceful climb. It was always going to happen under constant pressure, with the orcs acting like a whetstone that sharpened human military capability through endless conflict. One of the most interesting aspects of orc design is how well it would mesh with early humanity's survival needs. Humans evolved as a cooperative species, building cities, working in groups, inventing tools to protect themselves. Now imagine those early spacefaring humans encountering orcs. Every victory against them would demand better weapons, faster ships, stronger armor. Every loss would cull the weak and leave only those ready to adapt. The old ones may not have been thinking about humans specifically when they created the Krork, but the principles they built into orcs, relentless aggression, environmental adaptability, constant pressure on opponents, would later act as a perfect evolutionary catalyst for mankind's transformation into a war-ready empire. There's also the curious way orc warfare forces their enemies to unite. Among humans, petty rivalries and political feuds can drag on for centuries. But when orcs arrive, those rivalries suddenly don't seem as important. You either work together to push them back, or you get wiped out. Some fan theories suggest that the Imperium's foundational unity, the idea that humanity must be united at all costs against outside threats, is an ideological echo of countless ancient campaigns against orcs, fought long before the Emperor walked the stars. When you piece all this together, it's almost as if the old ones built the orcs to be the galaxy's permanent drill sergeants. They don't care who survives, only that whoever does is strong enough to keep the cycle going. And in that way, the Imperium's obsession with strength, discipline, and constant readiness might not be purely human in origin. It might be the result of living for millennia under the shadow of the most efficient biological weapon ever created. When the war in heaven finally burned itself out, the galaxy was left in ruins. The old ones were gone, the Cetan shattered, and the Necrons had retreated into their long slumber. Most of the great civilizations of that era were erased, their worlds dead or abandoned, their star maps useless in a sky full of ghost systems. But somehow, the Orks, or rather the devolved descendants of the Krork, endured. It wasn't by accident, and it wasn't because they had some secret refuge hidden away. They survived because they were designed to. The old ones had created them to function without leadership, without industry, without even a coherent society. Take away their gods, their masters, their original purpose, and they would simply keep doing what they were built to do: fight, spread, adapt. While other species relied on infrastructure, the orcs relied on themselves. Their spores could survive in deep space, dormant for decades, until they landed on a planet and began to grow. Even a single orc survivor could eventually repopulate an entire world. And because they could live on virtually anything, from fungus and squigs to whatever unwise prey wandered too close, they never needed supply chains or farming worlds. This is why, after the Old Ones vanished, the orcs didn't collapse like so many of their contemporaries. They just kept going, their endless tribal wars continuing without pause, only now the enemies were whoever happened to be nearby. This ability to outlast empires meant that when younger races began to appear, the orcs were already there, waiting. Some of the first spacefaring civilizations after the War in Heaven were likely small, fragile, and utterly unprepared for what a full whack could do. There are ancient ruins scattered across the galaxy that some fan historians believe were the homes of early stellar cultures wiped out by orcs before they ever had the chance to make alliances or expand. In that sense, the orcs acted like an evolutionary bottleneck. Only those races capable of defending themselves against constant green-skinned assault would survive to leave a mark on galactic history. And that brings us to humanity's distant prehistory. Before humans even knew the warp could be navigated, before they had colonized more than a handful of nearby systems, the orcs were already a galactic constant. The earliest human colonies likely encountered them long before the Imperium was a concept. These early encounters wouldn't have been grand wars recorded in shining archives. They would have been brutal, one-sided massacres where fledgling human settlements were overrun unless they could improvise weapons and tactics fast enough to repel the invaders. If you believe some of the fringe theories in the lore community, these ancient battles were the forge where humanity's martial instincts were reforged for the age of space. What's fascinating is how the orcs' survival didn't just preserve their own species, it indirectly shaped others. Every young race that emerged into the void had to contend with them. The Eldar, still young themselves after the Old Ones' fall, likely honed much of their early starship combat doctrine against orc fleets. Humanity's obsession with heavy fortifications and layered defenses, you could argue that came from surviving attacks by a foe who would never stop throwing bodies at your walls until they broke. The Tau, in their brief galactic history, learned the same lesson in record time when orcs descended on their space. It's almost poetic in a cruel way. The Old Ones created the Krork to fight their own cosmic enemies, but once the Old Ones were gone, the orcs simply became the galaxy's default test. You didn't get to claim a star system unless you could take it from the greenskins or defend it when they came for it. And they always came for it, eventually. This persistence is why some fans argue that the orcs' post-War in Heaven existence has been more influential on galactic history than the war that created them. Without the Old Ones to guide them, they became a decentralized, self-propagating force that shaped the developmental trajectory of countless species. For humanity, that meant evolving into a civilization that could wage war on a massive scale, maintain readiness for generations, and absorb catastrophic losses without collapsing. Because somewhere out there, another orc horde was always on the way. When you think about it that way, the orcs didn't just survive the fall of their creators. They inherited the galaxy, and in the long, dark millennia before the Imperium, they may have been one of the most important forces shaping the kind of species humanity had to become in order to claim its place among the stars. The earliest contact between orcs and humanity didn't happen in the age of imperial glory. It happened in an era when humans were scattered across the stars in small, independent colonies, each with its own resources, culture, and level of technology. The so-called Dark Age of technology was still far ahead, and most human worlds were barely holding on in the hostile void. Against that backdrop, meeting the orcs for the first time must have been like walking into a nightmare you didn't know existed. There's no single record of the first human-orc encounter. Instead, we have fragments, oral traditions from isolated colonies, scraps of archaeotech showing signs of crude but effective orc modifications, and ruins where the damage pattern screams greenskin involvement. These early meetings were rarely anything like diplomatic contact. Orks don't negotiate with species they've never fought. For them, the first impression is always a battlefield. And for humans of that time who had never faced a foe like this, it must have been a shock. They weren't dealing with pirates or rival colonists. They were up against an enemy that would keep attacking long after it should have been physically impossible to do so. It's interesting to imagine what that meant for human military development in those days. A colony that faced orcs and survived would never see warfare the same way again. Weapons would be upgraded to fire faster and hit harder. Defenses would be reinforced with layers upon layers of armor, because a single barricade could never hold an orc charge. Tactics would shift toward concentrated firepower and decisive strikes, because dragging out a battle against orcs only gave them more time to adapt. Even the idea of large-scale mechanized warfare might have gained traction faster among humans because of the need to counter orc war machines, which could roll across a battlefield belching smoke and shells, held together by little more than scrap and orc stubbornness. Then there's the question of technological exchange, not in the sense of trade, but in the way necessity forces innovation. Orc tech has always been baffling. It shouldn't work by human engineering standards, and yet it does. Early human scavengers who dared pick through the aftermath of an orc raid probably found themselves staring at weapons and vehicles that defied explanation. Some of that gear would have been too unpredictable or dangerous to use, but there are stories, half legend, half speculation, about colonies reverse engineering orc designs. Crude energy weapons, jury-rigged vehicle armor, even power systems that could be maintained with minimal infrastructure. All of these may have been inspired, directly or indirectly, by salvaging orc wrecks. What's worth noting is that the flow of influence might not have been entirely one-sided. Orcs are notorious looters, and they'll bolt anything useful onto their own kit, whether they understand how it works or not. Some fan theories suggest that certain orc weapon configurations from later millennia actually originated from early human tech they stole during these first encounters. It's a strange feedback loop. Humans take orc ideas and refine them. Orcs take the refined human versions and turn them back into brutal, oversized death machines. But perhaps the biggest impact of these early contacts was psychological. Fighting orcs taught humanity that there were enemies in the galaxy that couldn't be intimidated, reasoned with, or permanently defeated. The lesson was clear. Survival meant being ready for war at all times, not just in moments of crisis. Entire generations grew up with the understanding that the greenskins could come back at any moment, stronger and in greater numbers. This mindset, seated in humanity's collective consciousness long before the Imperium existed, might have laid the groundwork for the eternal war philosophy that defines imperial culture today. It's tempting to think of these early battles as isolated skirmishes, but over centuries, they added up. 100 little wars in forgotten corners of space, each one leaving behind scars, stories, and technological lessons. By the time humanity began to unify under stronger powers and prepare for large-scale expansion, the memory of fighting the orcs was already embedded in its military traditions. And even though these encounters were brutal, they might have been exactly what humanity needed to harden itself for the galaxy it was stepping into. The orcs have a way of forcing progress on anyone unlucky enough to share the galaxy with them. They don't mean to, of course. For them, a bigger gun or a faster ship is just another way to make the fight more fun. But for humans, facing an orc horde has always been a crash course in survival. You don't get the luxury of slow, careful technological development when your enemy is already at your walls, firing crude but devastating cannons that can rip a tank in half. Every battle becomes a laboratory. Every desperate defense a chance to learn something that might keep you alive in the next assault. From the earliest frontier skirmishes, orcs set a brutal standard. Their weapons might look like piles of rust and scrap welded together, but they delivered devastating firepower. Human engineers, forced to counter that, began experimenting with heavier armor plating, modular vehicle designs, and new weapon calibers that could punch through orc battle wagons. The need for raw stopping power drove advancements in mass reactive munitions and rapid-fire ballistic systems. Even the way humans designed turrets and firing arcs owes something to those early fights. when missing your shot meant getting overrun by a wave of greenskins who didn't care how many you'd already killed. Naval warfare saw the same kind of evolution. Orc ships are ugly, asymmetrical monstrosities, but they're built to ram, board, and keep firing through damage that would reduce an Imperial vessel to drifting wreckage. To counter them, human shipwrights started reinforcing hull frames, developing overlapping void shield configurations, and improving maneuverability so fleets could evade the brute force boarding tactics Orcs love. Entire doctrines of fleet engagement, focusing on long-range fire, layered formations, and precise broadsides, came from the simple need to stay out of an Orc ship's grab range. Tactically, the greenskins left their mark in more ways than people realize. Human military commanders learned quickly that static defense against Orcs is suicide unless backed by overwhelming firepower. Orcs thrive in close-quarters chaos, so the counter is mobility, coordinated strikes, and layered fallback points. Urban combat doctrine in particular changed drastically. Instead of trying to hold every street, defenders learned to channel Orc charges into kill zones, trading territory for the ability to slaughter them in concentrated bursts. This shift toward fluid, adaptive warfare later became a cornerstone of Imperial Guard training. But it's not just about weapons and tactics. The Orcs taught humans to think in terms of escalation. In a typical war between human factions, one side might be willing to negotiate after heavy losses. Orcs don't have that off switch. They get more dangerous the longer the fight drags on. That meant human forces had to plan for total destruction of the enemy, not just a negotiated victory. This mindset pushed the development of larger strategic weapons, from planetary defense arrays to ship-mounted lance batteries capable of cutting through entire fleets. Some fan theorists even argue that the seeds of humanity's eventual willingness to deploy exterminatus were planted in these centuries of fighting Orcs, where anything less than annihilation risked them coming back stronger. There's also the psychological effect. Facing Orcs forced humanity to normalize a state of perpetual readiness. Worlds on Orc borders became fortresses, their industries geared toward constant production of war material. Shipyards learned to work faster, not because they wanted to, but because they had to replace losses before the next whack arrived. This culture of urgency spread, and over time it hardened into the Imperium's war economy, a system where military production is the default, and peace is treated as a temporary lull rather than a permanent state. The irony is that in trying to resist annihilation, humanity may have absorbed some of the very traits that make the Orcs so unstoppable. They became more aggressive, more willing to throw massive resources into a single battle, and more accepting of constant warfare as the natural order. The Greenskins didn't just push humans to invent better weapons, they helped shape the entire mindset that would later define the Imperium. In a way, every bolter round, every baneblade, and every kilometer of fortress wall carries a trace of the Orc threat that demanded its creation. The Dark Age of technology is usually remembered as humanity's golden era, the time when mankind spread across the stars with unmatched confidence, building glittering hive worlds, forging vast trade empires, and mastering machines that today's Imperium can barely comprehend. But that golden light didn't shine in a vacuum. Even in that age of wonders, the galaxy was still dangerous, and one of the ever-present shadows on the edge of human expansion was green. The Orcs were there, waiting beyond the mapped trade lanes, ready to smash into the next human colony that dared to plant its flag too far from its neighbors. For all the marvels humanity achieved in that era, the Orcs played a quiet but crucial role in shaping how that expansion unfolded. Human fleets didn't just carry settlers and construction drones. They carried military escorts, planetary defense arrays, and entire divisions of troops trained for rapid deployment. Why? Because Orcs had a habit of appearing wherever the frontier pushed outward. It's almost as if they could smell the promise of a new fight. Colonies that ignored this risk often found themselves besieged before their first orbital shipyard was even complete. And while the advanced technology of the Dark Age could win those battles, the victories were rarely cheap. This constant threat meant that military considerations were baked into the very architecture of new human worlds. Cities were designed with wide kill zones, underground shelters, and integrated weapon platforms. Orbital stations doubled as weapons platforms capable of engaging entire Ork warbands in space. Civilian ships were often modular so they could be converted into armed vessels in case a convoy was ambushed. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities, born of centuries of knowing that somewhere out there, an Ork horde was already on its way. There's an interesting theory among some lore fans that the Orks of this period acted as a kind of pressure test for humanity's most ambitious projects. It's one thing to design a weapon in a laboratory, it's another to see it survive a boarding action by a dozen hulking greenskins smashing their way through the bulkheads. Many of the technologies that humanity later considered standard, from heavy pattern void shields to self-repairing armor composites, may have been perfected not in theoretical testing, but in live combat against Orks who simply refused to die. Even the scale of human fleets during the Dark Age may owe something to the Orks. The vast armadas that set out to claim new regions of space weren't just about projecting power. They were about ensuring that if a Wa-Yi appeared, there was enough firepower to smash it before it could gain momentum. This tendency toward overwhelming force carried forward into the Great Crusade, where Imperial fleets would routinely deploy at strengths far beyond what was needed to defeat most human worlds. That mindset, that bigger is always better when it comes to military strength, feels suspiciously like the kind of lesson you'd learned from fighting Orks for centuries. What's fascinating is how this shaped humanity's military culture. During the Dark Age, war wasn't just a defensive necessity, it became an accepted part of the expansion process. You didn't just plan for agriculture, infrastructure, and trade routes, you planned for sieges, orbital battles, and ground campaigns. This normalized the idea that war was a permanent state of readiness, something to be maintained alongside prosperity. It's no coincidence that when the Age of Strife tore the galaxy apart, humanity's descendants still knew how to fight. Those instincts had been drilled into them for generations by a green enemy that never stopped knocking on the door. In a strange way, the Orks of the Dark Age may have been one of the galaxy's most effective trainers. They didn't intend to prepare humanity for the horrors to come. They just wanted a good fight. But by forcing humans to constantly refine their weapons, expand their fleets, and think in terms of planetary defense on a grand scale, they ensured that even in collapse, humanity would remain a warrior civilization. The Imperium might like to believe that this mindset came from the Emperor's vision, but the truth could be far older, forged in battles against the same relentless foe that still hammers at the galaxy's gates today. When the Great Crusade began, the Emperor's goal was to reunite humanity under one banner, sweeping away the fractured remnants of the Age of Strife. His legions of Space Marines were the spearhead of that campaign, disciplined, genetically enhanced, and equipped with the most advanced war gear the Imperium could produce. But even with all that power, the Crusade's armies quickly learned that the Orks were not just another enemy to be crushed. They were a proving ground, one that would test the legions in ways no human foe could. Orks thrived in the same kinds of environments the Crusade wanted to bring under Imperial control. Resource-rich frontier worlds, isolated human colonies, and strategic systems sitting astride warp routes. These planets were rarely empty. If Orks were there, they were entrenched, their populations numbering in the millions, their fortresses sprawling across continents, and their fleets patrolling the void like predators. Taking such a world wasn't just a matter of firepower. It was a lesson in endurance, coordination, and the art of fighting an enemy that never admits defeat. The early Crusade battles against Orks revealed something about the legions. Raw strength wasn't enough. You could obliterate an Ork stronghold from orbit, but if you didn't secure the surface and root out every warband, the Greenskins would be back in force within months. This forced the legions to perfect the kind of sustained campaigns that demanded strict discipline over weeks and months of combat. Patrol routes had to be maintained, supply lines fortified, and every Marine drilled to stay alert, even in so-called pacified zones. One of the most important things Orks taught the legions was adaptability. No two Ork warbosses fought the same way. Some favored massed infantry charges, drowning the battlefield in bodies. Others built terrifying war machines the size of hab blocks, bristling with guns and armor plating scavenged from 100 different wrecks. Still others relied on speed, hurling mobs of bikers and truck-mounted warriors into lightning raids. A legion that tried to fight every orc the same way would bleed itself dry. Instead, the Astartes learned to read their enemies, adjust tactics mid-campaign, and use every tool at their disposal to break the cohesion of a wag before it could peak. There are countless examples in Crusade records of pivotal orc campaigns that shaped the character of entire legions. The Imperial Fists honed their expertise in siegecraft by cracking open fortress worlds held by greenskins for centuries. The White Scars refined their hit-and-run raids against mobile orc columns that seemed to appear from nowhere. The Ultramarines perfected combined arms strategies through grinding campaigns where they had to coordinate with Imperial Army regiments, Navy fleets, and Titan legions to overwhelm entrenched orc empires. Even the more brutal legions, like the World Eaters, found in the orcs an enemy worthy of their fury, one that could match them blow for blow and force them to push their ferocity to new extremes. The orcs also served an unspoken purpose in the Crusade. They were the perfect enemy to rally human worlds around the Imperial cause. Liberating a planet from a human tyrant was one thing, but driving off the greenskin menace that had plagued generations? That built loyalty. The Emperor could present the Imperium as a shield against the most dangerous threats in the galaxy, and every victory over an orc warlord reinforced that image. It's no coincidence that many of the Crusade's most celebrated triumphs, the kind that made it into imperial propaganda, were campaigns against orcs. Some fans argue that without the orcs, the Crusade might have struggled to unify humanity so quickly. Fighting human rebels is messy. It breeds resentment and political friction. Fighting orcs is straightforward. They're the villain everyone can agree on. And in the process of smashing orc empires, the legions forged the discipline, logistical systems, and combat doctrines that would later be essential during the horrors of the Horus Heresy. In that sense, the greenskins didn't just test the Imperium's armies, they tempered them into weapons ready for the wars to come. There's a persistent theory in the lore community that the orcs might be, in a strange and completely unintentional way, the Imperium's greatest ally. Not because they've ever fought side by side, they haven't, and they never will, but because their constant presence has shaped the Imperium into what it is. Without them, some argue, the Imperium might never have become so vast, so militarized, or so obsessively united in the face of external threats. In this reading of history, the orcs are less an enemy to be destroyed, and more a permanent whetstone against which humanity sharpens its blade. It's an idea that feels heretical from an imperial perspective, but the evidence is hard to ignore. For one thing, the Imperium's culture of eternal war makes much more sense if you see it as a reaction to the orcs' ceaseless aggression. The greenskins don't fight occasional battles. They generate an endless series of conflicts, big and small, across the entire galaxy. That means the Imperium is never truly at peace, and its military readiness is never allowed to decay. A galactic empire without an enemy like the orcs might have grown complacent, redirecting resources toward luxury, politics, or internal squabbles. Instead, the Imperium is constantly reminded that survival depends on staying armed and vigilant. There's also the unifying effect of having such a universally hated foe. Internal tensions within the Imperium are constant. Planetary governors squabbling over resources, sector lords vying for influence, Mechanicus factions jealously guarding technology. But when an orc is on the horizon, all of that vanishes under the weight of a shared threat. The greenskins have no interest in subtle politics, and they don't recognize treaties or ceasefires. They attack until they win or until they're wiped out. And that kind of enemy makes even the most stubborn imperial leaders cooperate. In that sense, the orcs unintentionally perform the role of an external glue, keeping the Imperium from fracturing completely. Some fans take the theory even further, suggesting that the orcs might have indirectly shaped the Emperor's vision during the Great Crusade. The Emperor had seen countless worlds, fought countless battles. It's not hard to imagine that his strategies for uniting humanity were influenced by the lessons learned from fighting the orcs. Lessons about speed of deployment, overwhelming force, and the importance of crushing threats before they can grow too large. Even if the Orks weren't consciously on his mind, the way they waged war had already influenced the way humanity thought about survival. There's also the matter of technological development. While the Imperium is famously stagnant now, during the Crusade and earlier ages, it still advanced in certain military fields. The Orks' constant adaptation forced the Imperium to refine its weapons and ships, at least to the extent allowed by the Mechanicus' rigid traditions. An empire without that pressure might have allowed its designs to go unchanged for millennia, weakening in the face of more dynamic threats like the Tyranids or the Tau. In this view, the Orks have acted as an evolutionary pressure, preventing the Imperium from becoming entirely brittle. Of course, there's a darker twist to this theory. Some argue that the Orks have not only strengthened the Imperium, but have locked it into a permanent war footing that makes any real progress impossible. The Imperium can't relax, can't redirect its immense resources toward exploration, diplomacy, or cultural growth, because the Orks, along with other threats, are always there to smash whatever fragile peace might emerge. It's a cycle that benefits neither side in the long run, except perhaps in the sense that ensures both remain capable of fighting forever. Whether you see them as accidental allies or eternal parasites depends on perspective. From a human point of view, the Orks are a scourge that needs to be eradicated. From a certain cold, strategic angle, they're a brutal necessity, the ever-present storm that forces the Imperium to keep its shields raised and its weapons loaded. And while it's hard to imagine the High Lords admitting it, part of the reason the Imperium is still standing after so many millennia might just be because somewhere out there, a tide of green is always coming, and humanity has no choice but to be ready. Within the Imperium, the Ork has become more than just an enemy. It has become a symbol. For millennia, Imperial propaganda has used the image of the greenskin as the embodiment of everything hostile, crude, and dangerous beyond the Emperor's light. This isn't simply a reflection of reality. It's a carefully cultivated narrative designed to shape the way citizens and soldiers think about war, loyalty, and the Imperium itself. When an Imperial guardsman sees a propaganda poster showing a snarling orc looming over a burning city, the message is simple and effective. The galaxy is full of horrors, and the Imperium is the only thing standing between you and them. This image of the orc as the eternal barbarian plays a powerful role in the Imperial psyche. It creates a clear, uncomplicated villain, one that can be blamed for destruction without the messy politics that come from human-on-human conflict. The Orks don't have ambassadors, they don't negotiate peace treaties, and they don't send envoys to the Imperial Palace. They are pure aggression and violence, and that makes them perfect for propaganda. You can rally a hive-world population with speeches about defending against the Ork menace without having to explain the finer points of galactic diplomacy. For soldiers, this image becomes even more important. Recruits in the Astra Militarum are often trained using exaggerated accounts of Ork brutality, tales of cities wiped out in days, of regiments swallowed whole by endless green tides, of monstrous war bosses capable of ripping tanks apart with their bare hands. While these stories have kernels of truth, they are amplified to create a sense of urgency and absolute resolve. The idea is to strip away hesitation. When the enemy is portrayed as inhuman and irredeemable, it becomes easier to fire that last gun without a second thought. Interestingly, this constant depiction of orcs as savage brutes has also shaped the Imperium's own military culture. There's a widespread belief among Imperial commanders that victory against orcs comes only through overwhelming force, total destruction, and absolute discipline. This doctrine has bled into how the Imperium approaches other enemies as well. Even foes who might be negotiated with are treated with the same destroy them entirely mindset that orc wars have drilled into Imperial thinking for thousands of years. It's an ideological carryover that reinforces the Imperium's obsession with decisive, often brutal solutions. Among civilians, the orc has taken on an almost mythical quality. In isolated frontier worlds, they are spoken of like monsters from a nightmare, creatures that appear suddenly out of the void, bringing fire and slaughter. Parents use the threat of orcs to frighten children into obedience. Local militias drill endlessly, just in case a whack comes their way. In this sense, the Orks serve not just as a military concern, but as a cultural anchor, a reminder that danger is never far away. There's also an ironic twist that some fan discussions point out. The Imperium's depiction of Orks as mindless savages conveniently erases their cunning. In reality, Ork war bosses can be brilliant strategists, capable of outmaneuvering entire Imperial battle fleets. But acknowledging that would undermine the propaganda's purpose. It's harder to inspire fearless defiance if you admit the enemy might outthink you. So the official narrative keeps the Orks locked in a simple box. Dangerous, yes, but not clever, in a way that threatens Imperial pride. Over generations, this constant shaping of the Ork image has had a lasting effect. It's reinforced a culture where war is not just accepted, but expected. Where the enemy is always alien, monstrous, and beyond redemption. The Orks, in this role, are almost like a psychological training tool. A constant reminder to the Imperium's people that survival means fighting without hesitation. Whether this benefits humanity in the long run or just traps it in an endless cycle of fear and violence is another question entirely. In the modern Imperium, the Orks remain one of the most visible and constant threats in the galaxy. They infest countless systems, from isolated frontier worlds to major trade routes, and their sheer numbers make the idea of exterminating them entirely little more than a fantasy. For most Imperial commanders, the Orks are a plague that must be contained, beaten back, and culled again and again. Yet beneath that official stance, there's a far more pragmatic and controversial view. Sometimes it's better to let the Orks live. This isn't out of mercy or some misplaced sense of respect. It's pure cold calculation. Orks are a natural predator for almost every other faction in the galaxy. They'll fight anyone, anywhere, without hesitation. If a sector is crawling with Orks, that means Tyranids, Chaos Warbands, and even rival human polities are going to have a much harder time gaining a foothold there. For some Imperial strategists, this makes the Orks a kind of living minefield. Dangerous, but useful, because they force other threats to waste time and resources. There are even whispers in certain military circles that some Ork populations are deliberately left untouched after being weakened, their numbers kept just high enough to cause trouble for neighboring Xenos empires. It's a dangerous game, of course. Orks never stay weak for long, and a warband that's left alone can swell into a full-blown wah with terrifying speed. But the temptation is always there. Better the Greenskins and the Eldar fight each other than both turn their attention to Imperial worlds. Economically, Orks also serve a grim purpose in the Imperium's war machine. Campaigns against them can be used to rally public support, justify increased tithes, and keep military production lines running at full capacity. Fighting Orks is clean from a propaganda standpoint. They're the universally hated enemy, the perfect villain for recruitment, posters, and victory parades. Entire regiments are built, armed, and deployed in long wars against Orks not only to defend territory, but to maintain the Imperium's culture of constant readiness. From a political perspective, the Orks' presence has another side effect. They act as a unifying external threat. In peacetime, Imperial governors and sector lords have a tendency to squabble, with petty rivalries and resource disputes threatening stability. But an Ork incursion can cut through all of that. Suddenly, the political bickering stops, fleets are mobilized, and planetary defenses are strengthened. In this sense, Orks become an involuntary tool of cohesion. No one wants to be remembered as the governor who failed to prepare for a greenskin invasion. Some fan theories go further, suggesting that the High Lords of Terra might even prefer the Orks to remain an unsolvable problem. A galaxy entirely free of greenskins might seem like a victory, but it would remove one of the key motivators keeping the Imperium's military apparatus running at full tilt. Without that constant threat, could the Imperium's already fragile unity survive? Or would the countless worlds of humanity turn their weapons on each other, fracturing into smaller empires, like during the Age of Strife? It's a grim thought, but one that fits disturbingly well with the Imperium's better the devil you know mentality. The irony is that for all the blood and treasure spent fighting Orks, they are as much a fixture of the galactic landscape as the stars themselves. Wiping them out completely would be a task beyond even the Imperium's colossal armies, and so they endure, part enemy, part obstacle, part unwitting shield. The galaxy turns, and the Orks keep fighting, their endless wars shaping the fates of empires, whether those empires like it or not. In that sense, they're not just a threat the Imperium tolerates. They're a force it has learned to live with, and in some dark, unspoken way to depend on. Looking back across the long, bloody history of humanity's rise in the galaxy, it's hard not to see the Orks as an ever-present shadow shaping the path of the Imperium. From their creation in the Age of the Old Ones to the modern day, they've been a constant test, hammering against humanity's walls, forcing it to grow stronger, faster, and more ruthless. The idea that the Orks might have been, in some twisted and unplanned way, co-authors of the Imperium's story isn't just wild speculation, it feels uncomfortably plausible. They didn't build ships for the Emperor. They didn't fight alongside the legions, and they certainly didn't care about human destiny. But by their very existence, they created the conditions that demanded a civilization like the Imperium to survive. It's almost poetic in its irony. The Orks were made to fight in a war that ended millions of years before humanity's first spark of intelligence. When their creators died, they became a force of pure momentum, rolling across the galaxy, crushing or burning everything in their path. And when humanity began reaching into space, they were there, ready to greet it not with words, but with bolter fire and choppas. Every lost colony, every desperate defense, every war waged against the green tide forged human society into something harder. By the time the Emperor arrived to unite it, humanity was already steeped in the mindset of constant war. The same mindset the Orks had been teaching, unintentionally, for centuries. There's a paradox here that makes some fans uneasy. On one hand, the Imperium sees itself as humanity's shield, standing between its people and the horrors of the galaxy. On the other, one of the most dangerous of those horrors may have been one of the reasons the shield exists at all. If the Orks had never been there, if the Old Ones had never made them, would humanity have risen to dominate so much of the galaxy? Or would it have grown slower, softer, more complacent, leaving it vulnerable to extinction when the first great crisis came? The very enemy the Imperium swears to destroy might be part of the reason it's strong enough to fight in the first place. This theory doesn't make the Orks friends, and it certainly doesn't excuse the billions of deaths they've caused. But it does cast them in a strange light, less as a random plague of the galaxy, and more as one of its great constants, like gravity or the warp. They are not just opponents, they are part of the ecosystem of war the Imperium thrives in. Remove them, and the galaxy's balance shifts in ways no one can predict. Keep them, and the Imperium continues to sharpen itself against their endless assaults, even as it curses their name. Maybe that's the real truth hidden under all the propaganda. The Imperium doesn't just fight the Orks because it has to. It fights them because it has always fought them. They've been part of humanity's story for so long that it's hard to imagine the Imperium without them. Whether they are a curse or a strange kind of gift from a forgotten age depends entirely on how you look at history. If we take the idea that Orks may have played an unintentional role in the shaping of the Imperium and push it further, we're left with a fascinating and uncomfortable line of thought. What would the Imperium look like if the Orks suddenly disappeared? Not a slow decline, not a fading presence over centuries, but gone overnight, erased from the galaxy as if they had never existed. It's tempting to imagine that the Imperium would flourish, freed from the constant drain of resources and manpower. But the reality could be far more dangerous. The Orks are not just an enemy, they're a constant in the galactic equation. Remove them, and you remove one of the main drivers that has kept humanity united, armed, and wary for thousands of years. Think about the Imperium's economy. Entire sectors exist in a permanent state of military readiness, their forges producing nothing but weapons, armor, and starships. Shipyards in places like Mars or Hydrafor are always building because there's always another Ork threat to face. If that demand disappeared overnight, what would replace it? In a sane, peaceful civilization, those resources might be redirected to improving civilian life, repairing infrastructure, or even exploring the stars with something other than conquest in mind. But the Imperium isn't built for peace. That industrial capacity wouldn't just shut down, it would be repurposed for other wars, likely against fellow humans. The green tide might be ugly, but it keeps a lot of Imperial guns pointed outward instead of inward. Then there's the question of military doctrine. For millennia, the Imperium's strategies have been shaped by the Orks' unique style of warfare. Overwhelming numbers, constant aggression, and a refusal to surrender. This has created an Imperial war machine that values brute force, decisive strikes, and total annihilation of the enemy. Without Orks to reinforce those doctrines, the Imperium might start adapting to slower, more methodical wars against enemies who can be negotiated with or contained. On the surface, that sounds good, but in a galaxy where threats like Chaos, Tyranids, and Necrons exist, losing the instinct for rapid, overwhelming response could be fatal. The Orks keep the Imperium's blade sharp, whether the High Lords want to admit it or not. There's also a strange, political dimension to consider. Orks are the perfect common enemy. They unite factions that would otherwise be at each other's throats. A planetary governor who resents the Administratum, an inquisitor who distrusts the Mechanicus, a chapter master who loathes the Ecclesiarchy. They can all agree that Orks need killing. Without that unifying threat, old rivalries would resurface faster and harder. The Age of Strife taught humanity what happens when unity breaks, and it's not a lesson the Imperium should want to relearn. The Orks, simply by existing, help delay that breakdown. Some fans have suggested an even wilder possibility. What if the Orks' disappearance created a power vacuum that something far worse would fill? The Tyranids are already encroaching on the galaxy from multiple directions, and without Orks to act as a living buffer, they could sweep into regions that have relied on greenskin resistance to slow them down. Similarly, Chaos warbands might find it easier to spread corruption in systems no longer hardened by centuries of fighting Ork invasions. In that sense, the Orks are like an aggressive immune system for the galaxy. Not protecting it out of altruism, but still attacking anything foreign that comes near. Remove that, and the infection spreads unchecked. Even culturally, the absence of Orks would leave a strange hole. In the Imperium, the greenskin is more than an enemy. It's an icon, a symbol of the galaxy's dangers, a simple story that keeps the populace in line. You can't terrify a hive world's workers into greater productivity with a lecture on the metaphysics of the warp, but you can with tales of Ork hordes burning worlds to ash. Without that ever-present image, the Ecclesiarchy and the Departamento Munitorum would lose one of their most effective propaganda tools. That could lead to unrest, questioning, and the kind of social instability the Imperium fears almost as much as alien invasion. And so, in this twisted logic, the Orks' continued existence becomes part of the Imperium's stability, a dangerous, bloody, tragic stability, but stability nonetheless. Their constant threat keeps the armies drilled, the fleets active, the forges running, the governors cooperative, and the people fearful enough to accept the rule of the High Lords without question. It's a brutal truth that no one will ever admit in an official record, but deep down, the strategists and politicians of the Imperium must know it. The Imperium might hate the Orks, but it also needs them. In the same way a warrior needs the weight of his sword to stay strong. If you strip away the propaganda and look at the sheer mechanics of galactic survival, you can start to see the Orks not just as a threat to be destroyed, but as a twisted kind of partner in the Imperium's continued existence. Not allies, not friends, but a force whose constant pressure has helped shape the Imperium into something capable of surviving in a galaxy that wants it dead. Without them, the Imperium might win peace for a moment, only to find it's far less prepared for the war that inevitably comes next. There's another angle to the Ork-Imperium connection that often gets overlooked, and it's one that makes the relationship between the two even stranger. The idea that the Imperium has, in some places, learned to manage Ork populations like a dangerous but valuable resource. It sounds absurd at first, the notion of tolerating any part of the green tide. But when you look closely at the realities of Imperial governance, you start to see patterns that suggest this is exactly what happens. The galaxy is too vast for the Imperium to police every world with equal strength. Some systems lie far from stable warp roads or sit on the very edges of Imperial space, surrounded by Xenos territory. These are the kinds of places where committing massive forces for a full-scale cleansing operation against orcs would cost more than the system is worth in resources. So instead, Imperial commanders often settle for containment, purging the orcs down to a manageable number, then leaving garrisons to watch them. The thinking is simple. As long as the orcs are busy fighting each other or harassing rival Xenos, they're not massing into a wave aimed directly at Imperial worlds of high value. In some rare and highly classified cases, there are whispers of the Imperium deliberately steering orc migrations toward enemy territories. Rogue traders, free from the constraints of Imperial law, are rumored to have lured orc warbands into Tau space or even into regions plagued by Tyranids. These stories, while impossible to prove, make a certain grim sense. After all, if an orc horde is going to rampage somewhere, better it be tearing apart a rival's infrastructure than yours. The orcs won't see it as manipulation. They'll just see it as another fight, and they'll thank you with a good walk before moving on. This idea of weaponizing the orcs as an uncontrolled force is not something the High Lords would ever acknowledge. It's far too dangerous as a policy, and it carries the constant risk of backfiring spectacularly. But on the frontier, where decisions are made by sector commanders who may never hear from Terra, pragmatism often trumps doctrine. If turning an orc warband against a greater threat buys you a few decades of breathing room, some will take the risk. It's the kind of ruthless calculation the Imperium is known for, sacrificing one region to save another, knowing full well that the cost will be paid in billions of lives. The deeper implication here is that the Imperium doesn't just fight the orcs. In some twisted, hidden way, it uses them. Orcs draw attention. They soak up enemy resources. They keep other predators at bay. Even Chaos warbands, for all their savagery, can be delayed or weakened by running headlong into a major orc force. In this light, the Greenskins become an ugly tool of galactic strategy, not by design, but by the sheer inevitability of their presence and the versatility of their chaos. Of course, this is a razor's edge to walk. Orcs can't be controlled, only nudged. Any Imperial commander who thinks they can truly dictate the path of a walk is playing with fire. But as dangerous as the tactic is, it feeds into the same paradox we've been circling around, that the Imperium's survival may in part be tied to the existence of the very enemy it claims to hate most. By keeping the orcs alive in certain regions, even if only out of expedience, the Imperium is quietly admitting that the galaxy might be even more dangerous without them. It's a truth that will never make it into the official histories or the sermons of the ecclesiarchy. To admit it would shatter the clean, simple image of the orcs as a mindless plague to be wiped out. But in the shadows of the administratum, in the sealed orders of the segmentum command, there's likely an unspoken understanding. The orcs are a problem that can never be solved. And perhaps in the darkest corners of Imperial thought, one that shouldn't be. They are both a curse and a convenience, and in the grim darkness of the far future, that combination is almost as valuable as a victory. And if you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most unexpected connections in Warhammer lore, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next time we dig into the weird, the dark, and the downright unbelievable corners of the 40k universe. There are still countless secrets out there, and together we can uncover them, one battle-scarred mystery at a time.